Good evening. This is going to be easier. So today we're just going to go through the then and now. So we're going to start with the long history of scenic rivers and how we started, and Rick will handle that. And then we'll go through a series of maps that I put together to talk about land protection, what's been done already, and what are some of the opportunities within the watershed, and a little bit beyond, because I got a little carried away. And Rick will go over what conservation easements are and kind of what the process is, and then also some of the funding programs that make it all possible. So as a quick introduction to Scenic Rivers, we are a private 501c3 nonprofit that works just in Anne Arundel County, and our whole mission is to protect natural and scenic areas in the county, and we work with landowners and other partners to do that. And most of that work is done using conservation easements.
All right, we're going to see how this juggling back and forth works, but normally when we start a presentation like this, the last thing we want to do is talk about ancient history and some old newspaper clippings. But Severn River Association is the reason Scenic Rivers Land Trust exists, and you were responsible for our creation. And I want to go over just a little bit of the history. And I'm not going to abuse the Margaret Mead quote, but a small group of people got together and got some good stuff done. Two events in 1988 were our inspiration. One was the publishing of Gems of the Severn by Colby Rucker. And the second was a paper that Gene Cronin delivered at the second Severn Symposium. Jan Holman, a name you will know well, was on the SRA board, got all excited about the presentation and the new book, and very quickly, within 60 days, she helped the president of SRA, which was Cliff Andrew at the time, draft a request to Lighthizer, County Executive Lighthizer, to say, you guys got to create a land trust, and you got to throw in a little cash and some staff support. So the idea was quickly embraced, and the next year, Jan Holman was named the Capitals Person of the Year. And the first thing on the list of her accomplishments, of which she had many, including a big role in the critical areas, was the fact that she helped create the Severn River Land Trust. Just to drop a couple names that you guys will remember, Roy Hoagland and Rob Bissell were early board, Charlie Iliff, Chris Swada, Robin Ward Ireland, some of you may remember, John Page Williams, Jim Martin. It was all SRA folks that got us going. And it really kicked off in 1989. Right away, we locked up our first property, which is 5 acres on Sullivan Cove, owned by Newth Morris. Again, who was affiliated with SRA. And at that time, this was a real growth of the land trust and land preservation movement. And there were 5 or 6 land trusts in Anne Arundel County that were slowly coming together. And just to confuse you and to jump forward a little bit, in 2003, the Severn River Land Trust changed their name to the Scenic Rivers Land Trust. The South County Conservation Trust in 2007 merged into Scenic Rivers, and the Bay Ridge Land Trust merged in 2013. Again, more history than maybe you want to hear, but all the roots of SRA making everything possible for us. The first grant was written in 1994 to the Chesapeake Bay Trust. I would love to write a grant that has as my project coordinator, Marion Warren. You're all familiar with his incredible photography. Again, brought in by SRA to help get this going. As a point of personal amusement, I was at the Chesapeake Bay Trust at that time. I was the grant reviewer for that proposal, and you can tell that Sarah wrote the captions on the slides.
It was a joke.
One of our first big activities was to help with the preservation of Brewer's Pond. Billy Molden, who you all know well, was really critical to that, but money was pulled together, about $1 million to preserve that. That was one of the early Severn River success stories. Now we've had enough ancient history, so I want to move from the black and white era to Technicolor. So we'll switch.
Color. So we went from almost all volunteer, or all volunteer in the beginning, and about 15 years ago we started growing staff. So we had a part-time executive director, and then Rick Leader came on about 10 years ago, I came on about 4 years ago, and our most recent addition is Erin Valentine, our communications coordinator who is here part-time and does an amazing job with our outreach these days. So today we are celebrating our 30th anniversary of our first conservation easement this year, and we just reached 3,000 acres protected 2 months ago, which was really exciting for us. We've been working towards that for a long time, and we hold 68 easements across the county. And in the Severn River watershed alone, we have 38 easements which cover 600 acres, which mostly is because we started in the Severn River watershed. So just to dive in a little bit into what we've done this year, so we've done 3 easements across 3 watersheds. One was in the Patuxent, one was in the south, and the last one was in the Severn River watershed. So the one in the Patuxent was 111 acres, and all but 20 acres was forest and wetland, and the remainder was a farm that had been in her family for generations. So she was really happy to see it protected, especially since it went up right against the Three Rivers development up in Odenton. And then the South River one was 82 acres, mostly forest, about 14 acres of field, and it was part of our Audubon and South River Greenway important bird area, which we have been working a very long time to try and protect. It's about 4,000 acres in the headwaters of the South River that are very important to a lot of species of birds. And then in the Severn River, it was also in Crownsville, same as the South River one. It was 93 acres and entirely forested and facilitated a really rare bog complex that had endangered and threatened species in it, and also that property had 2 historical archaeological sites on it. So also very exciting to protect. And all of those properties, which I'll talk about this a little bit later, they were all in a Department of Natural Resources targeted ecological area. Does anyone know what that is? All right, a couple of you. And also all in a green infrastructure network. Does anyone know what that is? Cool, excellent. And so we have 2 more projects in the works for this year that are pretty close to closing. One is also in that South River Greenway important bird area, and it will cover about 70 acres. And another one is all the way down in Herring Bay, and it will be about 22 acres, I think. So hopefully keep your fingers crossed for those 2. So just to give you an overview of the entire Severn River watershed and what's been protected already. All of these multicolored dots on the map are where land has been protected either by easement or by purchase from a government entity. So you can see that Severn Run is this big purple or light blue area, and that covers about 1,700 acres. And then some of you may have been involved with the Salin easement, which was 300 acres, or is. And then this complex over here of ag easements is about 450 acres. So those are kind of the big ones on the map. And just if in case you can't read the legend, all the red is Scenic Rivers easements. All the light green are agriculture and woodland preservation easements. And then there's the orange, which is county, and the dark green is forest conservation easements with DNR, or the county. And then, as I said before, Severn Run is that purple-blue area up at the top. So in total, the big easements, because I didn't have time to count all the tiny little ones, covers about 3,000 acres, which is just about 7% of the watershed. So if you add up all the tiny easements, you might find that we hit 8 or 9, maybe 10% of the watershed is already protected. Does anyone have any questions?
Is your new, the most recent one that you acquired, is that on the map?
Yes,
Where is it?
it would be right here.
So is that part of the Belvoir property?
It's not. It's close by though. It's very close by, but it's not Belvoir.
Do you have an estimate of the potential sites that might come into the trust? Do people have to contact you first, or do you go out and look at potential sites?
So we do both. So we kind of have, and I regret doing this, that I kind of have all of the potential properties that may be conservation easement opportunities as a kind of a mapped out, but I did not make that slide, and I thought about it on the way over. But I'll talk a little bit about some opportunities in just 1 second. Does anyone else have any questions about this one?
Is that map available on the web? Can you see that?
I just made it, so it's not there yet, but we could put it up there actually. Yeah. So again, an overview of the Severn River watershed. So this is showing green infrastructure, which is created by Department of Natural Resources. And basically what green infrastructure is it's forest or other habitat that is in large areas and is connected to each other. So you have these hubs where there's a large tract of land that is still intact habitat. And there's also corridors, which usually are red on the map, that connect all of those hubs. So it's kind of like a network for wildlife and where is the best places for them to live. And so you can see that there are a couple of hubs still left in the Severn River watershed despite all the development that's happened here. And the Green Cathedral is this, and then there's 2 more hubs above it. And then the Severn Run natural environment area is right here. And those connect by a couple connectors to Waterworks Park is kind of right here. And then the South River Greenway is right here. So that's where the important bird area is as well. So they kind of overlap. And this is all the Patuxent watershed. Huge complex of green infrastructure and a lot of wetland. Does anyone have any questions about this one?
I'm curious, can you identify the names of those big areas that are just above the Green Cathedral area? What are those?
I don't think they have names as hubs, really. They're more like North Severn River is what they're called.
I can find them if I go by.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is Manadeer Creek right here. So if you kind of look, probably if you look left when you go on River Road, it's probably it. Yeah. And so the next map is going to zoom in right here on where we're talking about. Actually, now that, or getting is the next map, sorry. So this one, the black is a little dark, but I chose that color just because it's easy to see on a multicolored map. So all the dark is where we've protected already. So you can see that there's been a lot of effort to protect those green infrastructure hubs. So again, this Lynn easement is here, Severn Run is here. This is the Navy Dairy Farm. And let's see. And so now it's a zoom in. And so you can see this is the Brewer Pond Natural Area, which the Severn River Association and Billy Molden and a bunch of other people helped protect and we co-hold a conservation easement on that with the Maryland Environmental Trust, which is the statewide trust. And then this is the Selin easement, so it's about 300 acres. I think it still has a couple development rights left, but not nearly as many as when before the easement was in place. And then up here is the next hub up. And so you can see the blue is where our easements are. So we have 4 actually close to this. So these are 2 that cover about 200 acres themselves. This is our second easement ever. And then this is one of our more recent ones. And this black one is our next big opportunity for the Severn River watershed.
Excuse me, could you point out General's Highway to us?
General's Highway is this right here. Yeah. And so this is 125 acres and it's on sale. And so this is what I'm working to protect as we speak. I'm looking for funding sources to protect it. And as you can see, it's right in the middle of a green infrastructure hub, so it would be devastating to lose it. And it has about 20 or 30 development rights according to zoning, so a lot of houses could go in there. So,
How much do you need?
well, it's on sale for $3 million. So we'll see what an appraisal says and what funding sources say, and maybe we can come to some sort of middle ground.
Is that the lumberyard property?
Yeah, so it's the sawmill property, the Garmin Brothers sawmill. So
That's the one on River Road?
it is, yes, yep. And it's all forest except for about 5 acres. So, and the landowners are conservation minded, so I think it won't be too hard to protect it as long as we can come up with the right number. Any questions about this one? All right. So another opportunity area is Severn Run. Not that there aren't other opportunities, but if you're going to concentrate land conservation, I kind of just picked 2 spots to focus on for this presentation. I'm not ignoring the rest of the watershed, don't worry. So the light blue is again Severn Run, which is already protected by the state, and all these beige parcels are part of my very rough GIS analysis of what are the conservation opportunities across the whole county. And so you can see there's about 7 or 8 parcels that could become part of the Severn Run natural area, but there's not a whole lot because it's mostly surrounded by either commercial development or residential development. So I keep an eye out. I've talked to some of the landowners, but nothing has come to fruit yet. Right. And just as a slight aside, because we can't help talking about this area, it's the South River Greenway, and this is where the Garmin property is. And so if you just go a little left, it's where the South River Greenway is, and we've been working for over a decade to try and protect this area, since this is where Bacon Ridge is. Does anyone know that one? All right, good. So this is where we hold Walk for the Woods every year. It's a county park, and we hold an easement on it, and we've been working ever so slowly to get other parcels protected. And we're hoping that, there's a lot of opportunity here, and we're hoping that throughout the years and through connections that we can get in contact with more landowners and protect more of that land. And I also just wanted to point out that, this hub can also, which I don't have on the map, can also, connect and feed and strengthen these green infrastructure hubs, which I showed earlier. So if you protect one hub, you kind of help the whole system stay intact by creating more wildlife habitat. And I also wanted to show that the Crownsville Hospital is right here. So it's right in the middle of a lot of where we're working. So we're keeping a close eye on that property and care what happens to it. Right. And then just to zoom out a lot. So this is the entire county. And the dark green shows what has been already protected. Although there's a couple red herrings in here because this layer happened to include federal land, so Fort Meade is included, which is not actually protected at all. But I couldn't parse it out very easily from that layer, which also includes the Patuxent Wildlife Research Refuge. So there's still a lot of other easements in here. The light green, which you might be able to see from your seats, is the green infrastructure, the greenways that haven't been protected yet. that a bunch of different agencies are working to protect. And the yellow are those targeted ecological areas that aren't quite protected yet either.
At the tip of the East Coast tip of the Broadneck, is that the naval research station in fact, or Sandy Point?
This right here,
Yeah, there.
that's Greenberry Point, which is also not protected. Yep. Any other questions? Cool. And this right here is Sandy Point State Park. So, oh, one last thing. The whole reason why I also wanted to show you this is all the pink, which might be hard to see from your seats. Those are all the properties that we think might have potential to be protected. So there's a lot out there. And it was a very rough analysis by me, not a GIS expert, so I need some funding to be able to make this a more accurate analysis, which I've been working on. In the south, it's mostly, South County rural farmland, which of course farmland is important to protect just as much as the forested parts of the county up north. So it's kind of split north and south on farmland being protected and forest mostly being protected. All right, and this is Rick's part.
All right, everybody grab a drink. We're going to talk tax law for a couple minutes here. We'll try and make it as painless as possible. So Sarah's pointed out, did the fun part. There's enormous opportunity, lots of opportunity to protect land. We keep talking about easements and conservation easements, and most people don't really know what they are. So I want to just go over a few nuts and bolts about what they're all about. It is a very special tool that'll only work in very special situations. There's a lot of places where it won't work. And then you're going to want other options. You can always buy land, you can do deed restrictions, but we find the conservation easement a very, very, very powerful tool. So what the heck is this thing? It's basically a contract between the landowner and the land trust to permanently reduce the development potential of a piece of property. And that's written as a deed that's attached to the property forever. So the landowner still owns the land. It's forever. It can be for all or part of the property. You can't move an easement once it's in place. If you put an easement on half your property and decide 20 years down the line you want to move it around a little bit, you really can't do that. It can allow some development. We've put easements on properties and then we get a call, somebody's building a house. Well, they were going to build 5 houses. And we negotiated an easement to reduce it to 1, and the rest of the land's protected, and it's protected in a relatively special way. You can also harvest trees often on an eased property. Some you can write them so that you can't, but since state law is biased towards protecting agriculture and forestry, most easements will allow sustainable harvest at some point. In the end, the landowner can sell it to anybody they want. The conditions, the contract that they negotiated stays with the deed and it travels with it forever. Boom.
Does it include mining rights? Does it include mining rights?
Yes, it does. And we usually, in this area, we usually say that take away all the mining rights. Because usually there aren't any, there are some gravel areas, but out west, that's a really big deal. It can even include air rights and all kinds of stuff. It gets very complicated. So why an easement? One, it's the most cost-effective way to preserve land. Most of our easements are totally based on tax incentives. So much cheaper than buying them. The landowner still owns the land and is responsible for maintenance. So the community benefits from this forest being protected, but it's also now still the landowner's responsibility to maintain. Provides more opportunities. It's voluntary. The landowner still owns the land. They don't have to allow public access. They can get bonus points if they do. Why the heck are we protecting land? You never want to forget clean air, clean water, beauty, and wildlife habitat. So what the heck is the process? I want to meet somebody that has a piece of property and wants to learn about options for conservation. I need to get to their kitchen table or their back porch. And I have to have a very personal conversation. Talking to you about your property is like talking to you about how much money's in your pocket. I need to know if you want to protect your land for your kids. I need to know if you want to protect your land from your kids. We need to know a little bit about your tax situation. We don't have to get into too much, but we need to put together a deal that's going to work for everybody. Sometimes once we talk to a landowner, it can take 10 years for them to push the button and say they're ready. We just closed on a 111-acre piece on the Little Patuxent. I met the woman 10 years ago. She wasn't sure, her parents had just died, she was still trying to figure out, different things that goes on in your life. She called us back, I said, I still have my file, I'm coming out to your property, and we preserved it. And it's a fantastic, near the Two Rivers development, it's 110 acres of wonderful forest and wetland that will never be developed. Once the landowner does that, makes the decision that they want to protect their land, that's when the work really starts to go. First, we got to figure out what's the zoning of the land. Many people think, oh, this piece of property is protected by zoning. Why would you want to go to the trouble of putting an easement on top of that? Zoning changes. We will put an easement on top of a piece of property that has no current development rights. Affects the appraisal, affects the deal a little bit, but the easements are forever, zoning tends to change. Then we get into due diligence. We have to do a title search. The last thing any land trust person wants to find out is that there's 4 relatives tied to a deed. That's when we all start going, oh my God, somebody's got to find cousin Billy, who got 1% of the land inherited years ago, and we got to get him to sign this contract. So title search is incredible, always very confusing for some people. We have to do surveys often. The tax maps are not accurate enough for us, and that all costs money. We sometimes need an appraisal, both for tax reasons or if it's a purchase easement. Finally, we do a lot of legal review. The tough part of all that is it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money. With new IRS standards, to get an easement done well costs about $8 grand sometimes, which is one of the reasons it's very tough to do an easement on a small property. We get a lot of calls, and can I do it on 5 acres? Can I do it on 3? The IRS is not particularly interested in those, and Sarah's going to talk about this a little bit better for the conservation reasons, but it's also bang for the buck. It costs just as much to put an easement on 4 acres as 100. And the smaller ones can suck up a lot of conservation energy. I put this nasty slide up just to remind everybody that conservation easements are a creature of the IRS and tax law. It's not the tree hugging part of government. I think we still have some tree hugging part of government. It's all tax law. This is page 1 of the rubric that the IRS uses when they're reviewing a conservation easement. So we are very careful about meeting all the IRS standards. Back to Sarah.
All right, so as you can see from Rick's comments, it takes a lot to put an easement on a property. So we have created some guidelines and policies for our organization to make sure that we're using our scarce resources wisely and also making sure the IRS doesn't get mad at anybody at the end of the day. So we do 10-acre minimum. We try and go higher than that usually, and the only time we go less than 10 acres is if it's right next to protected land. So, what it's next to is 100 acres, so we're adding another 5 acres, and it's right next to it, so it adds up together. The only other reason would be is it's really rare habitat that you're just not going to find anywhere else, and it's worth protecting that very special place, either just for the habitat itself or any rare or endangered or threatened species on that property. And then you also need a willing landowner. That's just the name of the game of what we do. And also, I need conservation values that can be either mapped or written about, or both. And that makes the IRS much more happy than me saying, it's a great piece of woods, there's some birds in it. So that would mean that it's in a targeted ecological area or a green infrastructure area, or there's rare or endangered or threatened species, or historical sites, or it's prime farmland with good soil, and it's in a rural legacy area or something like that. And I like those because it's someone else saying that it's worth protecting other than just us. So several organizations are saying, yes, this is worth protecting, we should do this. And so that then it makes it worth the tax deductions and all the money that is involved. And then not only is it because it's expensive to do it in the first place, but then somebody, which is usually me at this point, has to take care of all the easements that we have. So we have to do annual monitoring and reporting, which I lean heavily on my volunteers for. They do about half of the easements, but that still means I'm going out to about 30 or 40 properties each year and writing reports. And it also means that I'm going to make sure that we keep a good relationship with the landowner. Sometimes that's not possible, but when I can ask a landowner, hey, what are your plans for the next year or two? They can say, well, I'm planning to build a shed or another house. And I can say, before they start building that shed or house, you can't do that. Please find a different way to get to your goals. So it's a lot easier than taking someone to court about a house that they already built. But if they do decide to build that house instead, we also maintain conservation defense insurance through terra firma, which was set up by the Land Trust Alliance, which is a national land trust organization. And that basically, if I have to go to court or we have to go to court, it will pay for the majority of the legal expenses, up to about $500,000, which is very comforting for a small nonprofit. And to back up that terra firma insurance, we have stewardship and defense reserves to make sure that we can always pay someone to go out and do stewardship, and also to make sure that we can handle those expensive legal costs when we need to. And the last part, which is a new part about the existing easements, is there's restoration opportunities coming up. So there's stream restorations or invasive species management that landowners are starting to come to us for, asking for resources and funding. And what's nice is there's a very strong environmental community in Anne Arundel County, so I can say, oh, go talk to the watershed stewards or the river keepers or someone like that can help them get those restoration projects going and improve already conserved land.
Okay, a couple more slides where we're going to shift into things we need help with. So you're the voters that make this all possible, because a lot of what we're doing is driven by tax incentives that we as a society have decided are a good deal. We could give somebody a break on taxes and end up with 100 acres preserved. That's a good deal for all of us. And we need to keep talking about how cost effective that is to keep support for these very important incentives. First thing we need is that federal income tax deduction. This can add up to $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 on a big property. It's a major incentive. There's a special rule for conservation easements because that potential donation is so large that you can actually carry it out for 15 years to make sure a more middle-class person can actually use those tax incentives. The federal income tax deduction right now is politically very, very solid. We need to keep it that way. There's also options for a state income tax credit. That also seems to be still very strong, and there's state tax. When you do your federal taxes, it affects your state tax as well. Also still strong, Anne Arundel County has an excellent program where if you put your land in easement for the benefit of us all, you'll probably get 100% of the property taxes on the land forgiven. That's an important driver, particularly for land on the Severn. It's also more obligation on us when we're justifying why a property should be preserved, because it's costing everybody money. So our final test, after we've done all our research, when we want to preserve a property, is because we sit in front of 50 people in the neighborhood and say, hey, you guys are all going to have to pay just a little more taxes because we're going to give this guy a break to keep this neighborhood so much better. What we got here? So funding sources is key. Again, a lot of easements in our history were donated just by tax incentives. That's not going to do it anymore. It's getting harder and harder to find the right pieces of property. We need private donations that help us spend the time to talk to a landowner for 10 years before we can close a deal. we need to get a little cash on the table for some of these deals, because that's going to make the difference between getting the land we can get versus getting the land we truly want and truly has priority. So the more tools we have, the better. And one of the most fantastic things that happened in Anne Arundel County is during the Shue administration, we were able to help convince the county to move fee and lieu money from the FCA program to the Chesapeake Bay Trust to provide incentive grants for people to put their land under easement, putting not full payment, but a little cash on the table. And with that program, we preserved 411 acres for about $2.2 million. That's less than $6,000 an acre, and you know what land costs in Anne Arundel County. It's a fantastic program, great use of fee and lieu. Do a little politicking. The Pittman administration, who we think is going to be great, is still getting their feet on the ground. They've not provided us with an accounting of where the FCA money has gone, because we think there's a chunk of it missing. They also haven't made a commitment to continue to move funds into that grant program, and we do think they will. We're going to need your help to help us lobby for that. All of you have probably helped lobby for Program Open Space. Program Open Space money flows through DNR. It comes when you buy a house, you kick in a few pennies to help have, if you're going to have a nice house, kick in a few pennies for the park down the street. It's a very elegant way to generate funds, to pay for land in the community. We hope to use it maybe for the Garmin sawmill property that we mentioned. This is a critical piece of land. We got to figure out a way to make that deal work. Tax incentives aren't going to work for this guy. He wants to go move to the Eastern Shore and buy another farm. It's not that he doesn't want to preserve the land, but he's got to pay his bills. So let's see if we can help him and preserve a very important piece of land. Neat little thing that's come up, not so neat maybe. The Navy's going to be messing with Greenberry Point a little bit. That means they have to put together some mitigation money. It's called REPI money, Readiness and Environmental Protection Initiative. That's normally only for land directly near a base, but because it's Greenberry Point, they're going to dedicate some funds to the Severn, so we've got to keep an eye on that money. And then finally, there's the Agriculture and Woodland Preservation Program, which is the county grants to preserve ag land. Where are we here? Advocate, as you have, for full funding for Program Open Space. Once we figure out a plan, help us advocate for that last big piece, the Garmin sawmill on the Severn River. Continue to help us twist the Pittman administration's arm to keep an eye on this funded grant program. And most importantly, look at these land deals as they come along down the line. There's only a limited amount of conservation dollars. We've talked about a lot of ways that you can objectively evaluate a piece of property. We need to make sure we're getting the most conservation value bang for the buck. There's hundreds of programs or properties in Anne Arundel County that deserve protection. Every time, everybody's got a favorite one, but it's really important that we have a good process that evaluates one against the next.
And another way that you can help is to help us connect with landowners. Half the time when I talk to a landowner is because someone told them to come talk to me. So if you have any ideas on who could want to protect their land and it fits, or at least on the surface fits our conservation requirements, we have 2 workshops coming up. One is on Thursday, and the other one is next month on August 13th. And so it takes just an hour, and I go through what the ins and outs of conservation easement are and what the standard negotiations are and what the funding programs are, and it usually helps lead to really good one-on-one talks with landowners. And the other thing is to spread the word to tax, legal, and real estate professionals about our annual conservation easement breakfast briefing. We've held it for a couple years, and it's pretty popular, and I think it's doing a good job of getting the word out to a bunch of different professionals that also work with landowners for their estates or for their properties. And if they know about conservation easements, they might be able to identify a landowner that could benefit from a conservation easement. And it's also really helpful for real estate or realtors to know about easements, so that when one property with an easement on it goes for sale, that they know that they need to contact us or whoever holds the easement and kind of talk about what that easement entails for. Because you never want someone to buy a property and not realize that there's a conservation easement on it. And if the people that you have in mind can't come to these briefings or workshops, we're always happy to talk on the phone about conservation easements. So I meet a lot of landowners that way that can't come to the workshop but just want me to come to their property anyway. And that's it. Does anyone have any other questions about scenic rivers or easements or anything we talked about?
Rick talked about the REPI program. Could you go back to that slide? Would that be not too much trouble? We have in the room an expert on the REPI program, and I don't mean to call her out, but I think because the Greenberry Point is an issue in the Severn River in terms of both public access and its tremendous habitat value, could you say something more about the relationship between the REPI program and the Scenic Rivers Land Trust?
I don't know any of the details of what's going on at Greenberry Point. What we've just learned that because of the work that's going on, the REPI funds that normally aren't available in our area will be available, could be available for the Severn. I think those funds are best for purchase. Oh, it's only easements. Okay, so we're still learning, but it's just one more arrow in the quiver.
And it's mostly going to be geared towards public access. So especially if it can be water access. Yeah. Those are the big points.
I'll defer to an expert in the room if we've got one.
I'm sorry, Zoe.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh, this is heard that name.
Yeah, my name is Zoe Johnson. I'm the Community Planning Liaison Officer for Naval Support Activity Annapolis. So I administer the REPI program for the installation. We just were added to the Maryland REPI agreement in last year and put in our first application for funding for a conservation easement for fiscal year 19. And so we have been looking and working with partners, predominantly the Chesapeake Conservancy at this point, and I've met with the Scenic River Land Trust and other partners. We're looking for opportunities to increase public access within in and around the Naval Academy. We're not restricting access. There's no plans to restrict access on Greenberry Point, so I want to make sure that that message didn't come through. But we are getting ready to increase our mission out there. We're building guest cottages and have some other plans for increasing our moral welfare and recreation mission. We also are going to make some improvements to secure the area. The area at the southern tip of the access roads at Greenberry Point are within the danger zone for our small arms range, and we have a lot of unauthorized access in that area while the range is in operation. We have a lot of people that disregard the messages on Twitter and are walking around the fences and climbing through the fences. So we are going to start increasing our security out there so that when the ranges are active and we aren't allowing public access, that we can control that. But that said, we see a tremendous amount of interest in those lands out there, people using our marina, and just general recreation, and we recognize that there's a lack of that kind of access in and around this area. So we're bringing DoD dollars to the table. These dollars are spent all throughout Maryland and all throughout the country to buffer installations from different types of impact. In this area, the impact that we're seeing is interest in using our lands for recreation. So we're fortunate that we're going to be able to use some of those monies here in this area to work with partners to provide additional areas for accessing the water.
Do you have a partner with other agencies like the Nature Conservatory?
We have in the past. We often partner with the Maryland Environmental Trust. We've worked with DNR and the county, and who else have we worked with?
To get this sawmill preserved, we'll work with everybody.
Yeah.
TNC, the Nature Conservancy, is usually looking for much larger properties, and they're looking for endangered species. So they were involved early on in Bacon Ridge and moved on to some much larger scale projects. We can go to them for advice, just as we've gone to the Navy and other people. We'll go to everybody for advice. But in terms of who's working on the local level, Maryland Environmental Trust is one of our biggest partners. And then all the other environmental groups like you all that talk to a landowner and say, yeah, I heard about this easement thing and I know those guys and they're not crazy, go talk to them. That's the partnership that's most valuable for us.
Any other questions?
You have a nice slide about advocacy and the things we could do. How exactly do we do that? Is there a mailing list we should be on? Should we look at your website?
So we do have a newsletter. So there is a mailing list that you can add yourself to on our website. So you can just go to srlt.org, and then I think Facebook would be a great way. We have a Facebook page and we're pretty active on it, so we can send out messages that way as well. I think Aaron has us on Twitter as well. So, yeah. Do you?
Quick question. You mentioned a number of target groups. One appears missing to me is the banking industry, because often they either hold the mortgage or hold the title. I think Delaware Foundation, they have the title again.
Right.
And do you do anything for that audience? Are there any benefits you can bring to the banking industry for properties that currently hold?
Yeah, so they often also come to our conservation easement breakfast briefing, so like Caldwell bankers, and they also come. I think we try and advertise them as tax, legal, and real estate, just because those are like kind of the three things that we're really focusing on during our workshop. But we also have people from DNR or other environmental organizations or restoration companies come and learn a little bit more about the details and what's new with easements as well. So, but yeah, good point. Yeah.
The second question, the seawater rising, we look at South County, it's the most threatened area. Is there any greater interest as a result in getting,
That's a tough one.
property off their hands?
So there's two pieces to that. The IRS is looking at that. So we're going to give a big tax break and maybe some cash to preserve this chunk of land, and it's going to be underwater in 2 years. That's a tough thing to deal with. When you're looking at an easement and there's a bulkhead on the property, should we write into the agreement that you have to maintain the bulkhead or you can't maintain the bulkhead? And if we put a house near the water and it ends up getting flooded, do we need special information in an easement to say you got to pull out that underground storage tank for your heating oil, or you got to tear it? So climate change is going to make it really tough. On a more positive note, and this is happening a lot around Blackwater, people are coming to terms with the fact that we're losing marsh, that we should be protecting not the marsh, but the land behind the marsh so the marsh can migrate. That's ecologically much more complicated than it sounds, and for the first few years, it may look like hell. For the first few decades, it might not be that attractive. But in the end, that's what you got to do. You got to protect more land.
Eastern Shore looks like.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but it's a big opportunity. Land trusts are looking at it, but it's tough from both sides. If we're going to prioritize where we're going to spend money, if this chunk's going to be underwater, it's a tough one. So.
Do you guys work with the Maggie River Land Trust, or are you guys only the Maggie?
So we kind of separate our territory, but it's kind of blended lines. So we work in the Severn River watershed in south, and they work mostly in the Magothy River. But we work with them on certain opportunities. So we actually own a bog in the Magothy River, and they hold a conservation easement on it. So if there's an opportunity for us to work together, we certainly will.
And the other question but I don't know if you hold any easement, but you probably don't, on the Severn River, piece of property that went up, it went up for sale, and the developer paid off the taxes in order to be able to develop.
not sure which one that one is.
Not one of ours.
Yeah, not one of
That
ours.
story
I think we
doesn't
would have heard
matter.
about
Do you
that.
guys have protections against that?
Any easement is if somebody's got a mortgage on an easement, the easement's got to be subordinated to the mortgage. So if somebody couldn't pay their mortgage and the bank took it over, the easement does not go away. Banks hate to do that, so it's making it hard. It makes it hard sometimes to get an easement on a property that has a mortgage. A tax, if the government takes it over for a tax sale, they would have to condemn the property, and Maryland's got a very good track record of not condemning property that has an easement on it. That said, the government can do whatever they want when it comes down to it. But there's a protection so that mortgage, if something goes to tax sale or somebody just doesn't pay their mortgage, the easement still remains in effect.
Sounds like we've got it. We're around for any questions, please call.
And thanks for listening.
Thanks for
So thank you all very much. This was a profound experience for me. I'm sorry in a lot of ways that we let you go, that the Severn River Association would probably be much better off today if we had all stayed together and continued with a coherent, multi-pronged strategy to protecting the land. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah,
I see you.
yeah. Let me respond,
I see you.
real quick, let me respond to that because
Maybe it's a good idea. I can't go yell at developers. People are always like, why aren't you on the protest lines over at that property that's going to be developed? I have to build a relationship with landowners. Sarah's got to build a relationship with landowners, developers, whoever. So we can't be in the fray in an advocacy role and then go to somebody and talk to them about whether they want to protect their land from their kids. So we operate in such a little narrow margin that I think it could restrict you a little bit. Now some groups do it, and Magathie does a good job. You know, the Magathie side, Magathie River Association does plenty of advocacy. They don't do it in the name of the Magathie Land Trust. So it's possible, but there are advantages to having land trusts just sticking to their knitting.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's been a very interesting evening. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Sarah. Any further questions? Good night to all. Drive safe.